On April 26, 1986, the worst nuclear disaster the world had ever seen took place. In the very early hours of the day, the operators of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant located in northern Ukraine were scheduled for a routine maintenance check on one of the four reactors. Due to inherently flawed design features of the RBMK reactor used, as well as dangerous decisions by the operators that went against safety regulations, vital controls of the reactor were lost. This created a power surge that caused the reactor to drastically overheat and reach dangerous unstable levels, and because of this, an explosion occurred in the reactor. The explosion blasted nuclear debris into the sky, blazed toxic flames, and released radioactive clouds into the atmosphere. The meltdown caused the nuclear chemicals in the reactor to be exposed to the open air and resulted in a fire that would last 10 days. For every hour the fire burned, the radiation levels were the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs. When the explosion first occurred, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, determined it was best to keep the accident a secret in order to maintain political stability. They did not inform any of the public that there had been a nuclear meltdown and that people were exposed to high doses of radiation. It was not until 36 hours after the initial explosion that the USSR had decided to evacuate the nearby towns that were at risk. By the time people were told to evacuate, it was far too late as people were already feeling the effects of severe radiation poisoning. Over the next 20 days, toxic emissions from the reactor meltdown released into the atmosphere, and over that time, the USSR began evacuating 200,000 people from their homes. The accident itself to this day is reported to have directly killed only 31 people, although scientists suggest that the severity of exposure to the nuclear fallout from the event could be the cause of anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 illnesses and deaths resulting from long-term detrimental effects due to radiation poisoning. On top of the effects it had on the people of Ukraine, the fallout clouds had an extremely drastic impact on the environment, which helped further spread radioactive material. Everywhere within a 30-kilometer radius of the power plant was deemed the exclusion zone by the USSR. Within that zone, forests had turned red from radiation poisoning, animals were killed by military in order to reduce the spread of radioactivity, and small towns were bulldozed and buried to cover up any radioactive materials that lingered. To this day, the exclusion zone in Ukraine continues to be uninhabitable and riddled with high concentrations of radioactive particles, something that will not change for thousands of years.
As Chernobyl was built in the Soviet Union, the government ran the show. Chernobyl was built and run by the government. In accordance with the Soviet government's values, all the people's best interests were kept in mind when building Chernobyl and many other power plants. National pride and power were the Soviet government's main values. When Chernobyl was built in 1970, it was one of the early power plants to have a RBMK reactor, the national reactor of the Soviet Union. The RBMK was different from America's national reactor, the VVER reactor, as it had no pressure vessel around the core. This made it very cheap, which is great to make a large, powerful reactor. When the RBMK reactor was brought to fruition, it was the biggest and most powerful reactor in the world. And that, of course, gave the Soviet people great pride and implanted the power of the Soviet Union across the world. Now, with these two important aspects of a reactor, power and pride, out of the way, safety was forgotten. But, from the perspective of the Soviet Union, a nuclear reactor malfunction was physically impossible, even though it happened many times.
There are many stories about Anatoly Dyatlov, one of the main stakeholders in the explosion at Chernobyl, and what he did immediately after the explosion. Dyatlov, although allegedly caring for the safety of his employees, cared more about the plant than anything else. He did not want to believe that the RBMK reactor had exploded, And according to most historic interviews, although Dyatlov was not a generally liked person, he was a good employee and he was not the one to blame for the explosion and had been scapegoated by the Russian government. Dyatlov was influenced by his future, his possible health, and his denial when assessing the concerns post-explosion. Although he says he immediately regretted sending workers to check in closer on the explosion, it was that denial that the core could explode that cost the workers their lives and ultimately poses a view opposite to most about how to handle an unknown explosion and a nuclear power plant. After this point, he then began to realize the magnitude of the explosion, but he had been so exposed to the radiation that he needed to be hospitalized. Another 3 main stakeholders were the men who volunteered to dive under the plant to open the water valves. They were under the impression that by volunteering to go to the plant, they are possibly giving up their lives. This factor influenced most men not to volunteer to go. But the notion of saving hundreds of millions of people influenced these men to put their life on the line for their country and deal with the possible consequences down the road, if they arose. It is said that these men survived the mission, with one sadly dying in 2005 of a heart attack. When you look at the fact that he died at the age of 65, and 63% of cleanup workers reported cardiac or circulatory problems, his death was most likely accelerated due to the explosion, which shows just how important saving the general population was to these men, knowing it would lead to their possible death.
There were many ethical failures in Chernobyl when looking at it from a deontological perspective. The first major failure of duty was the engineers being negligent with their work. They didn't go through the proper due diligence to ensure that the safety test was ready to commence. They were rushed, and they should have cancelled it when things were put off schedule. But instead, they decided to go forward with it. Some more examples of unsafe practice was that there wasn't suitable radiation measurement equipment and protective gear present during the test. As well, the staff during the test were inexperienced and they were completely unprepared for a test at that time. The second major failure of duty was to the people of Chernobyl and the surrounding area by government and by other engineers. I would say a government's main duty is to protect the people of their nation, and the Soviet government completely failed in this regard. They waited 36 hours to evacuate the town of Pripyat nearby, and it took them a further 10 days to expand this evacuation radius, something that should have just been larger to begin with. There are also many examples of the government hiding flaws with the reactor and other issues they had on site instead of dealing with them and working with the engineers to ensure that this reactor would operate safely.
There were many ethical issues that occurred from Chernobyl. Of the biggest were the effects on members of society, the economy, and the political world. For members of society, Chernobyl resulted in hundreds of thousands of people having to evacuate their homes. An upward of 10 million people were affected by nuclear radiation. This radiation caused an uptick in cancer, cardiovascular disease, and an increase in birth defects. In the end, the human cost of Chernobyl is said to be up to 93,000 people. However, the official count from the USSR stands at only 31 people and has not changed since 1987. Financially, Chernobyl was also a great loss to the world. It cost over $700 billion in efforts to contain the nuclear plant and to remove nuclear fallout from the surrounding areas. To this day, there is the exclusion zone surrounding Reactor 4. People were initially told that relocation from the area was to be temporary. Today, it is still forbidden to return. Currently, efforts to reduce Chernobyl's impact include the creation of a large sarcophagus surrounding the facility, called the New Safe Confinement, that is planned to last the next 100 years. Of all the effects, politically, Chernobyl has affected the world in a very large sense. In the immediate aftermath, it is said that the explosion helped end the reign of the USSR. However, today, Chernobyl also plays a role. This is in our goal for a sustainable future. Nuclear power, shown through its tragic backstory, has halted governments through public and political opinion. As we look for sustainable energy, nuclear power is one of our best options, compared to intermittent power like wind or solar power. However, due to its reputation caused by Chernobyl and other similar accidents, it does not get considered.
In the engineer and geoscientists of British Columbia's Code of Ethics, The primary tenet is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, including the protection of the environment and the promotion of health and safety in the workplace. The course of action taken after the Chernobyl disaster went directly against this critical stipulation, as the lies told to the public did not uphold their safety or health, and the results of the explosion were extremely harmful to the environment. As leaders of the Soviet Union tried to prevent information escaping to the world, it became evident that these actions were made in the interest of the Soviet Union's reputation, as opposed to the welfare of the public. A number of other tenets, such as 4, 7, 10, 12, and 13 of the Code of Ethics, were arguably broken as well by these actions. The decisions made and the actions taken in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster had astounding effects on the world. These ethical failures were detrimental to almost all stakeholders and affected society, economy, and politics greatly. Widespread sickness and death, distrust in the government, economic hardships, societal collapse, and environmental destruction ensued, which saw public fear of nuclear power remain high to this day. The disaster at Chernobyl nuclear power plant remains the worst nuclear disaster in history, and perhaps one of the worst ethical failures of all time.